Are the Philippines postcolonial? The Philippines are a large group of islands located between the South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Altogether, there are 7,641 islands spread over 2,000 kilometres north to south, with a 2016 population estimate of 103,093,000 people. The people are a mix of Malay, Chinese, Spanish, Negrito, and Caucasian that speak over 80 dialects. The official languages are Filipino, which is Tagalog, and English, thanks to recent American influence. Before the Spanish arrived in 1521, there were Negrito, Proto-Malay, and Malay people that had immigrated to the islands. The Philippines were dominated by Islamic culture and probably would have ended up in political lines similar to Indonesia if it weren't for Spanish influence. It was named after Philip II of Spain, which is on the left, with Roman Catholicism as the dominant religion. The Spanish aim for colonization, which is in similar lines to the remainder of the Western colonizers, was for religious spread as well as to exploit material resources. The Spaniards also used the Philippines as a trading post to China and Japan. They ruled for over 300 years, from 1521 to 1898, with little intention to bring the country to self-governance. Over the course of the Spanish rule, the economy was not national. Trade with the global economy did not even go through Manila, which is the country's capital. The Philippine-American War, which was from 1898 to 1902, delivered the Philippines into the United States of America's hands, who had intentions of leading the Philippines to independence. In 1934, there was a 10-year transition plan for the Philippines to reach independence and establish a Commonwealth of the Philippines. In this way, it would be a client state that would remain an American base in Asia. However, global events hindered this process, like the outplay of World War II. Interestingly, the Filipinos were one of the few colonial people to fight for their colonial power in World War II. Official independence from the USA was granted on the 4th of July in 1946. Is it ironic that both nations' independence dates are the same? We'll soon see. From official independence until this day, the Philippines have been attempting to become their own nation. According to Goldstone, however, the Philippines is an island state still caught in the awkward process of becoming a nation. Mimicry determines a certain amount of colonizers' superiority over the colonized. In colonizing a country in a matching functionality as a homeland, the colonizers are announcing their authority and dominance of their systems of economics, politics, and social interactions that are superior to the colonized people. This justifies the domination of a subject people by creating representations of those people as ignoble, childish, and primitive. In this strategy, the colonizers are the loving father and are actually partly the oppressor. From the Philippine-American War, which was from 1898 to 1902, the Philippines have been described as orphans of the Pacific that were cut off from the Spanish fathers and desired by other European powers. However, they would now be adopted and protected by the compassionate embrace of the United States. And this asserts the belief that America is a culturally, economically, and politically distinguished nation. Immediately after granted independence, the Philippines' political structure was a competitive two-party political system, just like the United States. This lasted until 1972, when Ferdinand Marcos imposed martial law. On Independence Day, note that it was the 4th of July, Manuel Rojas, who was the president of the time, declared, "We are not of the Orient except by geography. We are part of the Western world, reasons of culture, religion, ideology, and economics. We expect to remain part of the West," highlighting the rejection of tradition and the grasping of the colonizers' ideals with thirst. Despite American attempts to bring the Philippines into political self-governance, they were unable to relinquish their dominance in the Asian base. The Metropole, which is America, supported Marcos' presidency, stating at the inauguration of Marcos in Manila that "We stand with the Philippines, and we stand with you, sir. We love your adherence to democratic principles and to the democratic processes, and we will not leave you in isolation." The United States adhered to this, giving heavy financial resources from a supposed once colonial power. In 1973, for example, the USA gave $85.7 million, which is contrasted to the $30.5 million just the year before in 1972. This begs the question, does the Philippines need the USA's support to actually be independent? Possibly one of the most obvious and influential evidences of mimicry in the Philippines is the implementation of the American education system. According to Zhang, education was an effective way to pacify and assimilate the Filipinos. The colonizers revamped the Filipino education system with English as the main method of instruction. In this way, American culture was indoctrinated into the younger generations who would feed American superiority to the remainder of Filipino society. The colonized people's minds were captured into a colonial mentality. This implementation of the American education system put the indigenous Filipino culture into an inferior position that would eventuate in complete rejection of traditional culture. This education system is still in practice today and is an excellent example of a successful replication of the United States system. Cullinane agrees that the introduction of democratic institutions within the colonial context contributes significantly to the consolidation and legitimation of local elite dominance. In Filipino society, there has been and remains a flavour of westernization and Americanism. For example, a Filipino man wears a suit to work, or a Filipino woman wears jeans to the shops. This is a very modern cultural norm that has only existed in the last 100 years or so. The question forms, is this just cross-cultural dressing? Or is this Barber's Mimic Man, which is an uncanny imitation of the real thing, doomed for inauthenticity? This is also a very simplistic illustration of black skin, white mask, the concept where Filipinos are white but not quite. American sports were also introduced into the Philippines, such as baseball, which is pictured on the right. Baseball was introduced as early as 1903 and has continued its legacy in the country. In these ways, the Filipinos are behaving socially as if they were Westerners, but it is obvious through their physical characteristics that they are not actually Westerners. Interestingly, the most evident makes of cars in the Philippines are Fords and Chevys, which are both American makes. The American attempt to produce a copy of itself in the Philippines was not entirely successful. Goldstone comments that by 1985, the Philippines were no longer acclaimed as Asia's economic and political showcase for democracy. Its political system was bankrupt and governed by a dictator in ill health, and that dictator was Marcos. Possibly their greatest legacy of mimicry in the Philippines is the remaining education system. Now moving on to hybridity. Failure of absolute mimicry of the colonized produces many different forms of cultural, political, and social hybridity. This construction of a third species raises questions about nationalism and individual post-colonial identity. In the modern Filipino context, it is the remnant of predominantly American and Spanish influence that has generated this third species. There is not a clear distinction of what is Filipino and what has been imposed. Filipinos have been so profoundly Americanized that the claim of an autonomous and distinctive identity is ludicrous. On examining the physical appearance, the Filipino people are a combination of multiple ethnicities. Go explains that the Filipino race was the waves of Mongols from the north, Malays from the south, together with the Great Spanish Tidal Wave and the stagnant Aboriginal Negritos. Overall, the Filipino people do not consist of distinct and separate types, for the types merge together into each other through intermarriage or mere infiltration of culture. The Philippine frontier had preserved their unique Filipino blend since the Americanism hit the islands. From the beginning, the Americans did not set up a process whereby disparate social and ethnic groups would combine to become a nation-state, except in a superficial sense. In light of the physical appearances of the Filipino people, it is a contested issue as to what it actually means to be Filipino. Does it mean the genetic makeup, or the mannerisms and behaviours of Filipino people, or the collective political and cultural behaviours that determine a large proportion of society? One thing is for certain, that Filipino people are constructed by otherness. It is undeniable that the Filipino people were influenced politically and culturally by America. In this way, the Americanization of the imperial frontier thus became the Filipinization of American frontierism. The native elite was trained in the Western ways, yet were always reminded that they were subservient to Western powers. It may be argued that the modernist elites claimed their identity based on two differences. Number one, that they were different from the colonizers because of their native characteristics, and then they were different from the masses and did not exhibit degenerative attributes of the colonizers with the best native elements. Therefore, Philippine identity was a separation from the native and from the paternal attitude. Nick Joaquin famously stated in the 1980s that the identity of a Filipino today is a person asking what is his identity. It is imperative to determine what it means to be an individual Filipino in order to collaborate and understand the allegiance the peoples have to the nation. Is it an allegiance to the USA? Or is it an allegiance to the Philippines, which has been so heavily influenced by foreign powers that Filipino actually means a combination of multiple foreign influences? For example, in the Philippine-American War, the Filipino willingness to fight and die was for social reasons and not for national objectives. As several presidencies have continued, and especially with Ferdinand Marcos' exploitation of the Philippines in general, nationalism is a common ideology on which to contest political control, and is one with which the Filipinos are well acquainted. Filipinos at all levels of society now feel limited connection to their US friends, who failed to respond to the political and economic needs of the population, and so they feel alienated. As Weekly points out, it is arguable that Filipinos do demonstrate a reasonably high level of national consciousness, but that is not the same thing as commitment or faith to the nation-state. So this lack of determination of a national identity hinders the post-political status of the Philippines. Now we look at language. Language is a method of communication in all spheres of influence. Not surprisingly, language has evolved over the colonial era, restructuring the colonized and arguably elements of the colonizers' dialects. Enforcing the perceived superior American English language on the colonized is an example of how the colonial encounter seeks to infuse and structure societal change on the local scene. Pidgins and Creoles develop as a result of attempted mimicry, resultant hybridity, and eventual acquisition of colonial influence. Usage of local Pidgin and Creole that is created from the Pidgin proves that metamorphosis in language was developing despite the inferiority of the colonial other. In this way, the colonized are not always seen as incompetent and capable because they can integrate the colonizers' methods of communication into their own, and therefore recarve control over an aspect of their daily lives. So in this way, hybridity in language evolves, forming this third species of crossbred dialogue that is not native to the metropole or to the marginalized. It, however, assumes that the colonized are once again inferior through their vernacular discourse. So in the example of the Philippines, there have been so many foreign influences that there are so many numerous dialects that are all different from each other. This is represented in this picture, where it shows the tongue, which is the Philippine national flag, and is a representation of the inability to communicate with each other, hence the tongue-tied, through all the different languages that are present in the Philippines. These different languages are in the background. You can see Tagalog on the right there. And so in this way, communication is key in forming identity, and if the Filipinos can't understand each other, how can they understand who they are as a whole? It is interesting to note, though, that English is one of the two official languages of the Philippines. Goey explains that English was seen as the vehicle for the spread of Anglo-Saxon ideas of freedom and liberty, counterpoised against Spanish as the vessel of cacique tradition. The other official language is Tagalog, which in itself contains thousands of Spanish, English, Malay, and Chinese loanwords. In the official Filipino language of Tagalog, the allegiance lies primarily with Spanish. Out of the 30,000 root words in the Tagalog language, 4,000 are Spanish. Over 40% of informal conversation of Tagalog is made up of Spanish loanwords. So, for example, if you look at this box, the United States which in Tagalog and Spanish are exactly the same spelling and exactly the same words. Estados Unidos, I'll try and pronounce it. And same with the meaning for handsome, which is guapo, and reality. But then we look at mug and ice, which are the English translations, and they are relatively the same, but the spelling is a little bit different, but they sound the same. Now we look at the English. So out of these 30,000 root words, over 1,500 are derived from English. Zhang explains that English as the imposed lingua franca was instrumental in de-Filipinizing and Americanizing the Filipinos. In essence, by Americanizing the Filipinos, and in this point it's by language, de-Filipinization was occurring, a gradual shift to the adherence of the superior metropole, which is America. The implementation of the American schooling system, which was delivered in English, authoritatively altered the communication sphere of the Philippines. For example, if you look at this box, you can obviously see that the word for automobile in Tagalog is nearly the same, automobile. And as you look down the list, so braces and braces, nurse, teacher, and tricycle, they are all very similar. Sure, the spelling's a little bit different, but they are pretty much said in the same way. And even now, when English-speaking foreigners talk about Filipino people, they say that Filipino people can speak English really well. And this is attributed heavily to the education system in which English was the main method of instruction. Despite the Spanish influence in language, English is raised as the victor in the colonial encounter. It is one of the official languages of the Philippines and has woven itself into the Tagalog language. The Philippines, in a historical context, has been bombarded and infiltrated by foreign influence that has shaped its current political, economic, social, and cultural identity. Attempts at mimicry imposed by the United States, in the most part, bred hybridity rather than producing a replica of its own perceived superior conduct. An exception is the education system that is common to both the United States and the Philippines. Go argues that the Philippines was an experimental field for their progressive, which there is the Americans, experimental field for their utopian project of transforming a patronage society into a corruption-free homestead landscape of independent proprietors and craftsmen through severe colonial education and practice under paternalistic guidance. Basically, what this is saying is that the Americans wanted to practice their way of governance on another country without the corruption. They did this through education and watched and guided the Filipinos closely like a parent would watch their child's development. Hybridity is also definitely evident in the Filipino context, both in physical appearance and in social interactions. It asks the question, what does it mean to be Filipino? And then how is that identity represented on a national scale? Then we looked at language, which is the basis from which all communication occurs. Inherently has its roots from colonial imposition, aiding the confusion on national identity. Guillermo comments that there is little political value in declaring oneself as a post-colonial subject while existing within a situation profoundly still in neocolonialism and imperialism. Post-colonialism, in its undefinable term, can be applied to the Philippines in some aspects. Despite their criticisms of dependence on the United States and the inability to function without foreign assistance, it is argued that Philippine post-colonialism is probably the most advanced in Southeast Asia. And here are my list of references. Thank you.